meeting, and then there is something in the Oval Office. I don't know what that practically means, but everyone seems to be nervous what the first visit of the German Chancellor will bring or how it goes. And at the same time, there are very limited options what he can do or offer, because when we speak of trade as an important topic, whenever someone currently meets the President of the United States, then what he can offer in terms of trade is relatively limited, because we have shifted trade competencies on the European level, and whenever you want to sign a trade agreement with the United States, you don't sign it with Germany, you sign it with the European Union as a whole, and there's a commissioner in charge of speaking on behalf of the 27. So when we speak of the European Union and Africa, we can of course go through all the different policies, but normally we look at it from the perspective of what are the crucial factors that define the relationship between an organization, the European Union, and on the other hand, a continent that doesn't really represent in the similar way an organized structure. Yes, there is an African Union, which I refreshed my memory, came into being as the African Union because of massive lobbying and financing by Gaddafi from Libya. He was sort of the driving force behind it to change the organization of African states into the African Union. And if you then look at the institutional architecture, it doesn't look much different, because they use the European Union's polity as a blueprint to move in the direction, which is also very often a European Union method. If you don't have shared interests, you start with institutions, and then function follows form. You agree on a certain form, and then you end up with, well, if we talk long enough and if we organize everything in an institutional procedure, then we might end up with something like a common denominator. In the case of the European Union, we came a long way. So this is already in a number of ways something that is far beyond an international organization. When we look at the power that has been shifted from a national level to a European level, the fact that the European Union negotiates on behalf of the member states when we talk about trade, I already mentioned. And it's also a legislator, which normally international organizations don't do. And what they legislate is not only legally binding, like a perfect example of multilateralism, in which you tie your hands if you are part of the negotiations, and in the end, if we agree on something, European law is stronger than national law. So a lot of this sounds like impossible for any other form of regional integration, but we decided that this is not a loss for the member states in terms of autonomy, but it's actually a gain, that if we get our act together and we form a single market that currently counts almost 500 million citizens and consumers, then we have a strong asset in negotiations with whoever, let it be the President of the United States or the Communist Party in China, or a much more heterogeneous counterpart, the African Union, or a group of countries in whatever part of the world. So this is pretty unique in terms of the level of integration and also how attractive the project of pooling and sharing competences and resources became since its founding in the 1950s. And we currently count 27 members that are fully committed to everything previous rounds of deepening, as we use as a metaphor, like shifting and strengthening the competences of this supranational level of governance, to strengthen this in order to get things done. Because the weakness of international organizations lies in the fact that there's always someone who steps on the brake and sells his or her veto in unanimous decisions as the decision mode, you never get anything done. And then you sit down and talk, but there's very limited outcome. In the case of the European Union, almost everything we collectively address is decided with qualified majority voting, although in the media we read a lot about can we improve the functioning of the European Union by giving up unanimous vote. Unanimous vote is strictly limited to war and peace, foreign policy, taxation, social policy, and everything else is qualified majority or even lower thresholds to get something done. And the reason why those few essential policies that make a state are subject to unanimous vote lies in the fact that this goes to the core of what makes a state. And if we would allow a majority of countries to decide that we Germans should spend more money for an enlarged European budget to address all the urgent needs on this planet, like supporting a booming economy in Africa or addressing climate change because the global south is more affected compared with the immediate effects in Europe, then German taxpayers wouldn't really understand how this could possibly be that others decide as if we have a shared credit card and we all use it, and in the end Germany pays. So that is kind of a limited acceptance from a country that in general is very committed to be part of a deeply integrated organization. So this is currently the state of play in the European Union, that we pool and share a lot of competences, but we don't go the critical next step and turn this organization into something like the United States of Europe or any other form of a completed system in which we know how it works and we know who belongs to it. It's still, right from the beginning and today still is, an ongoing process that invites more states to apply for membership if they are committed to what this organization stands for, which highlights that it is a value and principles and norm-based organization, which in return also sees itself as a normative actor that exports norms and values and principles, which causes a lot of intellectual and political and cultural debates whether there is such a thing like universal values, and if and how and why it's legitimate to connect certain bilateral agreements with non-European countries with conditionality to define we only do trade or finance investment in your economy if you comply with what we consider good governance or environmental standards or the role of women or how we treat children or religious minorities or whatever else. So this is part of the self-definition of what this organization stands for, and it causes a lot of problems because if we look at the historical relationship between this continent or the organization that hosts us today and the African continent, then what immediately comes to mind is colonialism. And in colonial relations, there was a similar paternalistic attitude of we make the rules and you follow, sometimes by force or in most cases by force. And after the end of a colonial relationship, it was more based on incentives, that if you want to benefit from the trade agreement or the framework that the European Union developed in its different long-term development agreements like the Lomé or Cotonou, or most recently in 23 the Samoa Agreement, then you have to accept certain conditions that other parts of the world don't formulate. If you sign an agreement with China, it's just mutual interest-driven agreement, and there's no such thing like we tell autocratic systems how to be less autocratic, or we define religious rules that we pay attention to, or protect minority rights or whatever. It's a different form of bilateral trade agreements or foreign direct investment agreements or whatever else it is. Another difference is that if this organization defines itself as a rule of law based and values and principle based organization, then it thinks back to how this form of deconstructing authorities came into being. And then everyone in Europe would tell you that this has a lot to do with enlightenment. So in the 18th century, we came up with the idea to question authorities by the beauty of the human mind. So if you have a better line of argumentation than the person in power, you are the one who wins. So critical thinking is the driver for everything that allowed us to develop in science and also to deconstruct autocratic and authoritarian systems, no matter if it's a religious power or if it's an aristocrat or a king and queen or whatever. So we deconstruct power relations and highlight the importance of the individual. And when we look at the core pillars of what the European Union is and does, then it is a political organization that puts the citizen at the center of everything. So it's hardcore individualism in action. And on the other hand, when we look at the economic system that is based on a market economy and flanking policies, and since the 1990s also a monetary union, then this focus on market citizens is also strictly individual, because at the end of the day, you decide what you want to do with your money. And then depending on what kind of welfare state you belong to, you also benefit from buffering risks or public goods or whatever your state provides. But at the end of the day, it's you are protected by a number of laws because you are an individual, and we are afraid that the state could limit your freedom rights, and therefore we need a system that is committed to the rule of law. So both the economic system as well as the political system is the DNA of this organization, the European Union. And if a country feels committed to this, it signs a self-binding commitment to implement every single piece of law that is already part of the acquis communautaire, the legal body of the European Union, and you don't have any chance to negotiate any exception or something. You might get a bit of a transition time until you're ready to implement every single part of it, but no matter if it makes sense in your particular case or not, there is no exception, because if you open the package and allow a form of cherry picking, then the legal space that in essence means it's the same law to everyone would come to an end, and then it's not an integrated space but something like a Swiss cheese in which everyone decides, I comply with this but I don't comply with anything else. So if they are as strict internally, it sometimes is difficult to deal with such an organization externally when we speak of mutual relations. And if it is interest-driven, because at the end of the day, this is not just a beautiful idea, let's unite the continent and happily live in peace, but it's also something in which member states accept to limit their autonomy because they expect a public good provided by the organization. And no one of you would be a member in a club that does not deliver what the club promised to deliver when you decided to join. So there must be something like a benefit for the members to be part of that organization, and therefore the organization tries to satisfy the member state's interest, and that makes it sometimes a tough negotiator. When we look at the relationship that is not just heavily affected by the historical relations and all the mess European states left in former colonies, then the point of view in this part of the world, when they think outside of the box, although the whole process of European integration is first and foremost navel-gazing, so it's more about what can we do to improve our relationship, to optimize the free flow of goods, services, capital, and labor. How can we harmonize certain regulations? How can we provide public goods that a single state cannot provide? So it's a lot about inward looking and not so much looking what's going on around us. So when I studied this, starting in the 80s, 90% of literature was about inward looking economic, cultural, political, institutional, sociological, whatever questions, but not so much and what is the story with the outside world, with the exception of specific trade relations, but that was just something for experts in the field of trade and not something like a geopolitical self-definition of what kind of role the European Union wants to play in the future. And now we find ourselves in a changing world. And in this changing world, a lot of what we thought is a given is no longer a given. And it's extremely challenging, not only for us, but also for other parts of the world, to define a strategy, what we want to become in the future, and how we prepare ourselves to be resilient. And if we want to de-risk, as another buzzword, for whatever form of relationship, let it be energy imports from Russia that are subject to decoupling, more or less. And when we speak of dependencies on the United States, when we speak of security, not something we can perfectly rely on. We will learn more about this by the end of the month when we have a NATO summit, but already today, an hour before we started, the defense ministers came out with a very strong statement how much more they want to spend on defense, which in comparison with how much more we want to spend on climate change and development looks like an absurd amount of money, but we live in different times, and the happy lifeline that war ended with the creation of the European Union on this continent, and territorial conflicts are so 20th century that we don't need to think about it anymore, because if you integrate as deeply as we have integrated, everyone would shoot himself or herself in the foot if he or she starts a hot conflict with a neighbor. So internally, this, for the time being, is perfectly accurate. It created the longest phase of peace within the territory of the European Union, but this is just an island in a sea of different rules and norms and mindsets and missions of autocratic leaders who think that they want to rewrite history, and therefore war is an option and not just a potential threat scenario. And therefore we start to rethink security, and as a byproduct of this rethinking of security, in the political and academic discourse, we start to securitize everything. And as a consequence of securitizing everything, we look at different parts of the world from the perspective, and what does that mean in terms of security, which is not always a healthy approach. Because when we look at the interconnectedness of different policies, then for years in this continent, the most pressing number one topic was climate change, and we had kids demonstrating on Fridays as Fridays for Future, and one could win elections with a green and climate change oriented agenda. This is now over because it's the economy stupid and everything is about security, and the German Green Party returned back to the opposition bench, and the new leaders express that they try everything they can to return to a competitive Europe and securitize everything and come out with all kinds of absurd gestures. The absurd part was not the official speaker of the European Commission, that was the citizen speaking. But when you look at German borders, we had for a long time a visible outcome of European integration that domestic borders don't physically exist anymore. You have a sign that welcomes you this is now Poland once you cross the bridge and you're no longer in Germany, or if later today I drive to Saxony, then Brandenburg will greet me at the edge of the city of Berlin, and a little later at a sign at the highway Saxony will greet me, but that's it. So you don't notice borders within the Federal Republic, and the same applied to the Schengen area of the European Union. And now the new government mobilizes every possible police officer and border guard they could possibly activate to orchestrate something like border controls at official checkpoints, which implies that if you actually want to cross the border from Poland to Germany, then you can just take your shoes off and walk through the riverbed, because it's not really a river at that time of the year, and it wouldn't stop you from entering German soil. But they produce pictures for the news that people feel that finally a German government is doing something to protect the German nation or economy or whatever fields it should be protected. And that's not only a discourse within Germany, which is a country of 85 million people, and I said already the European Union counts almost 500 million. And when we look back to, and that's the securitization story from 2015 onwards, when we talk about migration, everyone talks about it and what kind of security risk do appear with people crossing borders and either legally applying for asylum or come in whatever status, and what does that do to our societies. When I took the subway to come here, Al Jazeera called and asked if I would be available for an interview tomorrow to talk about migration and the implosion of the Dutch government, because this is all about migration. And they would like to discuss how complicated the migration situation is in Europe, if it even leads to something like the end of a coalition in a country that was known as a stable and sound democratic government that is not freaking out by infrastructure problems or integration issues, but that's hot enough to make Al Jazeera a story tomorrow afternoon. And when we look at numbers, the UNHCR expects that until 2050, 86 million people will be forced to leave their home because climate change would change conditions to a point where you couldn't survive if you stay where you call a place your home. So 86 million. And of course, they wouldn't all pack their things and run to Europe, but if 10% of them come to Europe, it would be almost 10 times what we saw since 2015. Because I checked numbers to prepare myself with data for the conversation with you today, and I learned that the African continent is responsible for less than 1 million people since 2015 arriving in the European continent. And we make it look as if this is the end of our civilization as we know it, like a friendly takeover by people who come in large numbers. To be fair, this is just the African continent. If we include Syria and Ukraine and Afghanistan, the numbers look different, but we still talk about numbers that are in proportion, totally out of proportion, if we have 500 million people in one of the richest parts of the world, and those political systems have signed a self-binding commitment that they help people in need. And on the other hand, when we look at demography, Africa is fast growing, and if I'm not mistaken, it's something like 70% of the population older than, no, 70% of the population is younger than 30, while in our case it's the exact opposite, that 70% of our population is older than 30, which is not what you see when you walk in the streets of Berlin. But Berlin is not Germany, and I think by now Germans in the definition of the Alternative für Deutschland are now the minority in this city, because 40% of people like me who have never left Germany in the last 200 years meet 60% of people who either have a migration background or as you come from wherever you come from. And that makes Berlin such an interesting, diverse, pluralistic, and from a cuisine point of view, also much more interesting city to eat out and enjoy the different cuisines of the world. And it also helps to make the city such a successful business model for startups. It's not the kids that are born in Spandau or Rudo, but it's the ones who feel that this is an attractive cosmopolitan place, and if enough cosmopolitans think so, the city becomes cosmopolitan, which is, I guess, also part of the story why Stanford students feel like studying for a while in the city. And the city pretty much lives up to the expectations because they all come in large numbers and meet other people who have a similar idea of it, and then Germany shows a young and diverse and interesting face that differs from other parts of Germany that are harder to access, but it gives a biased picture of who we are and what that practically means. So there's a lot to discuss with Al Jazeera tomorrow if they want to combine the political state of play and the situation of migration in this country. It's already 4:42 and we have an expert on Africa, because I'm not an expert for Africa, as you have already noticed, but Sabine announced to come here at 5, and I have multiple opportunities to listen to myself talking, so that was not the reason why I came today. So I think I'd rather stop here and we start for the remaining 15 minutes a Q&A and see if Sabine will be here on time. And then I try my best to answer your questions or add to what I haven't addressed yet, because I made more notes than what usually fits into the frame of such a program. But for now, thank you very much for your attention. And the floor